All right, so we'll just get started right off the bat. There are the first major thing that you need to be aware of whenever whenever you're looking to get into real estate is that uh, you'll hear a lot about no money down things, a lot about different possibilities for uh, buying properties with not a single penny out of your pocket. All sorts of a lot of gurus sell this and whatnot, and there are strategies with which to do that. There are ways to purchase properties without spending a penny. In fact, we've done it where we've actually got money back, but that is not the standard way to do it. Generally speaking, whenever you're purchasing a property, you need to expect that you're going to have to leave a little bit of money into the property as well. And so, for the most part, um, you don't want to go in with absolutely nothing. If you don't have any money yet, my recommendation would be to either look for a partner to work with, or to continue to save, or maybe go into wholesaling or becoming a real estate agent or something like that. If you find a great steal, then go for it that way. But generally speaking, the idea that you can buy a property without any money in the bank whatsoever is not probably going to happen. It's not something you should rely upon, especially since the way to find the best deals is generally like direct to seller marketing or things like that, and those things are going to cost some money regardless. But I've broken down the main ways to finance buy and hold real estate, and the way I would say is this: the first one is simply to save and hold, is just to purchase is just to keep your job wherever you're working now and try to live underneath your means, which is sort of the prerequisite to any sort of buy and hold strategy. It's really the prerequisite towards building wealth in general. You need to have a sort of a mindset that you're going to put money aside every single month. No matter what, you're going to find a way to live underneath your means. That way, as you build up your resources, you find you start to be able to invest more. If you're just living hand to mouth, there's no money to invest. You're just consuming every little penny. And really, that is the difference. I mean, there's the famous Stanford marshmallow experiment that everybody has probably heard of. Those deferring gratification is probably the greatest thing that you can do to get yourself to the next level. As far as strategies go, so the first one is save and hold. It's just very conservative. Just build up your wealth slowly with your job and whatnot, then purchase a property, then continue to go through it. Add that rental income to your total income, and continue to go forward, and just maybe buy one a year. And then as you go further, you can either perhaps quit your job and go straight into real estate, or you can just continue to do it this way. I know a lot of people who have continued just use real estate on the side and either have a property management company or maybe they do the management themselves on the side. Another way is that I highly recommend is, especially for newbies, is the FHA or the 203K program. They're basically the same thing. The 203K as a rehab component. So if you need to get construction, or like the property needs to be repaired in some way, you can get additional funds to do that as well. But the FHA, it only is for homeowners, and you have to live in the property for at least a year. But you can buy up to a fourplex. So you can buy a duplex, triplex, fourplex, or just a house. But if you buy, let's say, a fourplex, you can live in one unit and rent out the other three. And this is great because it allows you to. The great thing about this is that you have it finances up to 96.5% and at a very good interest rate. Now you do have to pay mortgage insurance anytime you borrow over 80% of the value of a property. You have to pay the mortgage insurance, which is usually adds maybe 80 to $100 or something along those lines, depending on the size of the loan. So you do have to pay that, but still you're getting 96%, very little money down, and you're also getting a very good interest rate. So both of those things combined make for a really good investment, a really good program, and you can do it on properties that need construction, or need some repairs with a 203K loan. On those, you simply need to basically submit an estimate of repairs or a bid from a contractor or something along those lines, And then at that point, as you do the work, submit invoices and whatnot, they will release funds that they had in escrow. For investors who are buying in their own name and don't have any properties yet, the Fannie Mae program also is a very good source. You can find this through any mortgage broker from any bank pretty much. What you can do with these is you can get up to 10 of them. Now they have to be in your name. You can't put them in an LC. You could transfer it to an LC after the fact, but that would technically trigger the due on sales clause. So a bank could foreclose if you do that. It's highly unlikely they would, but I'm not going to recommend it because I don't think it's worth the risk. That being said, you can still get up to 10 of these. You can get they're better interest rates. Generally, there'll be a 30-year amortization, whereas if you're going through a community bank, you're usually going to have, particularly in the Midwest, maybe not so much in the more expensive coastal markets, but particularly like in the Midwest, the South, less expensive markets, they're usually only going to give you about a 20-year am, or they're about 20-year amortize the loan over 20 years, so you have higher payments. And then, so I would be careful with that. But generally, you're going to get a better interest rate. You're going to get a 30-year amortization. And in addition to that, I think they lend up to 80%. Most others do not. And so the next one, that's definitely something to look at. The next one is HELOCs. If you already have a loan on your property, getting a HELOC, it's just a home equity line of credit. It depends on the bank, but I've heard of them going all the way up to 90% equity. Like if you have a loan on it, getting a second on there. It's a little bit trickier, especially after the financial crisis. Second mortgages have definitely gone out of style, but they are, particularly HELOCs are coming back. Interest rates aren't bad. The one thing I would warn you about a HELOC, if you're using that HELOC to say get a down payment, let's say you already own your home, you're getting a HELOC to buy another property. You don't want to have your HELOC all the way at the top for a long period of time, because banks will generally see that as like maxing out your credit card kind of thing, in which case that's going to hurt your credit score. We've actually had that happen once because we were afraid that a bank was going to take away our one of our HELOCs, so we had it kept up all the top. It was a very small one for us, and that actually hurt my father's credit score quite a bit. So be careful with that. I'll take a question or two before I move back into the other styles here. From Patrick, I have about $10,000 saved. I want to buy an investment property at 22 to 23 after college. How many years of income do I need to be able to show? Generally, banks want to see about 2 years of solid income. That being said, there's other things. It's not exactly. I mean, that's like with FHA wants to see 2 years, but there are other possibilities. For example, if your parents were so interested, you could perhaps partner with them, or get them to co-sign the loan. That would be helpful. Or if you have some sort of income coming in, I mean that can be a big boost there as well. FHA is a little bit stricter than other banks. You could also go from other possibilities, perhaps even getting a part-time job or something along those lines. So it's one of those things where I'd recommend talking to a bank. Generally, a community bank is going to be more lenient than sort of federal programs like FHA or the Fannie Mae program. But yeah, they're going to want to see a decent track record. I mean, it's the same when you're screening for tenants. Generally we want to see a year of employment history. And if we don't have something like, let's say it's somebody just out of college, we're going to want to see a cosigner or something along those lines. So yeah, if you're just coming out of college, you don't have an rental income history, it's probably going to be tougher to use something like FHA, which wants to see about 2 years. But you might be able to go with like a community bank, especially if you're already saving up some money. Let's see. So let's see. I'll jump back in here to some of the other ways to do it. One of them I do like a lot would be flip and hold or wholesale and hold. And this is sort of like a rinse and repeat type of method. And so if you're, again, I'd go back to the point. You can't really have no money. You do need to have some. You need to have saved up some money either for marketing or for going over budget or things like that. But with a flip and hold, basically what you're doing is you're flipping one house to get the money to live off of. You're flipping the second house for the down payment for a third to hold. I mean, it's not going to work exactly like that. Maybe you get an incredible deal and that gives you enough to live off of and buy a house. Or perhaps you get a really bad deal and you kind of have to, you just break even or you lose a little bit of money on it, you move to the next one. But the idea is buy one to live off of, buy one to get a down payment for a new house, and then buy the next one to hold and just keep on going for that way. This one, I'll jump real quickly into hard money loans, because a lot of people use hard money loans for flipping. I would say with regards to holding, hard money loans are pretty much out of the question. Generally speaking, hard money is going to get you about 12 to 15% interest. They're going to be 3 to 5 points, and it's so expensive it's hard to hold unless you get a really great deal, like you're doing a burst type of thing, which we'll talk about in a second. You get a really great deal, and then you refinance out of that hard money loan once you've rehabbed the property. Really, hard money is not an option for holding. So why? I got a question from Nicole. Why would a beginner get into real estate now while there's so much risk? And the reason I would say getting into real estate now, I mean, first of all, I'd be very hesitant to time the market. It does feel like we're at a bit of a high. I would be more cautious now than I would have been in the past. But at the same point, there's always good deals. There's always good deals around. And if you can find a great deal, that insulates you from market corrections. I made this point before, but the biggest difference between, say you have buying in the stock market or buying in the real estate market, the stock market is more or less efficient. I mean, yeah, there's good deals here, there's good deal there, but they're really hard to find. And if you look at the performance of hedge fund managers, they don't find them. Warren Buffett has a bet. I think he took it with some hedge fund manager, and all he did was invest in the Dow Jones or the Fortune 500 index, Dow Jones index, and he just knocked the socks off of that hedge fund manager. So it's very hard to find good deals. Real estate, that's not true because it's very local and it's also individual. You can find motivated sellers. You can find properties that have value plays, or maybe they need a lot of rehab and something like that. You can force that appreciation, or find properties that are just simply undervalued. And that, if you can buy a property with a 25 to 30% margin, that insulates you from a market correction. So I had a friend who kind of sat on the sidelines for a while with regards, because he thought the market was too hot, and he bought one house, but he didn't buy as many as he could have at that time. And that was a couple of years ago, and the market's continued to go up. So I'd be hesitant to time the market. Economists still haven't figured out how to do that. They're still failing miserably at timing the market. So I don't think we're going to be more of a Nostradamus type with regards to timing the market than PhD economists from Harvard or whatnot. Maybe we're better than them, actually, now that I think about it. But it does feel like a high. The market has been going up for a long time. My estimation, if I had to make one, would be that it will probably cool off in the next year, and maybe even dip. And so that just means you need to be more careful. It doesn't mean not to get in, but it does mean you need to be more careful. So from Blackjack Guru, what are your thoughts about opening up an LLC, getting credit cards with 0% interest for 12 to 18 months, and buy, renovate, rent, and refinance before the interest starts? I don't think I guess the biggest question would be, can you get enough credit cards with 0% interest that you're going to be able to make a sizable, enough to actually do the purchase or anything like that, or if you're looking for the excess funds for the rehab. I've had friends who've used, who saw an incredible deal and basically got, used their credit cards to purchase it. That was even without the 0%. I would just say it's one of those things where I would want to have a fallback option, a little bit of cash in the bank or something like that, or be able to stomach having some extra into the property. I don't think that's a bad idea, but at the same time, rehab tends to go over budget, so you can't rely on being able to wipe away all of the debts. You need to have some sort of fallback. So if you're doing a strategy like that, especially if you're using credit cards that have an extremely high rate of interest, even if you're waiting for that interest, trying to pay them all off before you get to that point, you need to be very careful about that. And it's preferable to have, and I really would say you need some money in the bank or some way to pay off those credit cards, even if you can't refinance all of it out on the back end. And what we're referring to here is the Burr method. I'll real quickly go over that. The Burr method is well, I'll go into private loans here real quick. Private loans is our favorite way to purchase properties, and basically what we're looking for. This is not like the hard money lenders who are going to charge you, 12 to 15%, 3 to 5 points. These people can charge you whatever. I mean, they can charge you 2% interest, but generally we're paying 8 to 9% interest with no points. And these are just people, random folks who have some money. I mean, one's a retired insurance agent, another's a doctor, just all sorts of different people who are sick of getting 0.2% or whatever it is these days in a CD and want to actually put their money to work. And so what we do is we give them a trust deed or a mortgage, depending on the state you're in, but they're basically the same thing, and a note guaranteeing their loan is the first against the property. It's basically just like a bank loan, except for it's to a private individual. The way we do it is interest only at a higher rate of interest. And then we do the rehab. So we try to finance both the purchase and the rehab. Try to finance it all because we're trying to get a property that's 75% of its market value or better. And then once we've finished the rehab, once we've gotten the property rented, then we go to a bank and we try to refinance it out. That's the BRRRR method. Buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. And the one thing in that respect I would say with regards to the refinancing component is that a lot of banks require a seasoning period. So if you own a property so basically they will only refinance what your cost into the property is. So let's say you bought a property for $80,000 and you put $20,000 into it. You're into it for $100,000. Doesn't matter if it appraises for $150,000. They'll only lend on that $100,000 until the seasoning period is up. And this just varies on the bank. We've had banks with 2 years seasoning. We've had banks that will refinance it at appraised value the moment it's rented. So this is one of those things about you want to talk to banks and figure out what they want before you start working on that aspect. So I recently bought my first duplex to house hack. The duplex came with 6 acres of usable land. What strategy should I use to start financing developing on the land? So this would be moving into construction loans, and construction loans are not that bad actually, because oftentimes you can use the property itself as basically the collateral and get the construction financed. And a lot of banks are interested in doing that. They are probably a little bit less interested than they were a few years ago, but there's still plenty of construction going on. There's still really a housing shortage in the country. Now I think it's area dependent, but they're generally like there's housing shortages in New York and San Francisco, but there's not necessarily a housing shortage in Topeka, Kansas. So at that point, you're going to a bank, you're looking for a construction loan, and they're going to want to see, like an architectural plans. You're going to get the permit process and whatnot, and they will release those funds. They'll put the money in escrow and release it to you in pieces based on certain points in the project. So like once you've gotten to X point, say all the utilities are in and the foundations are laid or whatever, they'll release the next amount of money to continue the construction. So it's paperwork intensive, but banks are certainly willing to do it, and oftentimes you can use the property itself if it's unleveraged. If it doesn't have a loan on it, if the property has a loan on it, that might be a problem. You might have to bring some, pay off that loan and put some money, put down 25% or whatever they require. But if the property doesn't have a loan on it, at that point you can use that property as the collateral and usually get most of it, if not all of it, financed, the construction itself. This is from Daniel. Using HELOC to purchase my next property, all cash, quotes, then using the snowball method to pay down my HELOC to buy my next. The more houses I buy, the bigger the snowball, the quicker I can pay it off. That is absolutely true. It is as you grow. Like for example, it kind of reminds me of a story I read in the Millionaire Real Estate Investor about several investors, this husband and wife team, that used all of their. They buy a property. They'd get a loan on it for 75%, 80% or whatever, and then at that point they would just use all of their extra money, their rental income, their own. They both had their jobs and whatnot, to pay down that mortgage to zero, and then they'd buy another house with a loan, and then they do the same thing, and they just use all their extra money, other than money to live off of course, pay that down to zero and just move on from there. It's a very, very conservative strategy, but it's not. There's nothing wrong with it. And it builds it. The more properties they have, the more money they're bringing in, the quicker you can pay down those mortgages. So there's a major snowball effect. So one of the reasons I like buy and hold so much is because it's exponential. It starts small, and then eventually it just starts to take off. And as as you're paying more and more principal down, as the property appreciates, as you have more cash flow, more on top of each other, the quicker you can buy more and more. It's a get rich slow scheme, and it really is like, even with us, it was just like there's just one point where it's like it's just this long slog, and then one point all of a sudden it's like, wow, it's working, it's there. And so definitely think of it as sort of a snowball that picks up speed. It will take a while to get there, but it's the best. I'll just out and say it. It is the best get rich slow strategy, best get rich strategy there is, but it takes a while. So let's go back into this. So we went over private loans a little bit. With regards to private loans, I would say my recommendation, if you're looking to get private lenders, and I think private lenders is probably my favorite way to continue to invest, to buy properties to hold. I would say that the thing you should do is sit down with a pen and pad and just start writing down anybody you can think of who might have some money, who might have money that they're willing to lend money sitting in the CD. Maybe they're not 100% sure about it, but why not? Just write them down. Just see if you can get 10 names down. And then once you get 10, then try to get 20. And if not get 20, why not 30? And then at that point, it's just, create a quick elevator pitch, maybe about a paragraph long. And then, just ask them, like, by the way, I'm doing this. I'm buying real estate. I was curious, if you might be interested in maybe lending on that, I can get you a lot better returns, kind of thing. It depends on how well you know the person and whatnot. Put together a business plan, whatever resume you have, if you've bought properties in the past, even if it's just a property to live in. If you've, then take them out to lunch, talk to them about it. It sort of builds on itself, especially when you can get somebody who's willing to vouch for you. And of course, if you've got mom and dad or an aunt or uncle or something like that, that's probably the best place to go. Just keep it easy with the guilt trips. You want to be very careful whenever you involve family in business. And be very careful with their money too. It's very, very bad if you lose it. But that's the best way to look for private lenders. I would say be very careful with regard if you're looking to advertise for private lenders. I wouldn't recommend that, just because you're getting into issues with regards to no call lists, and you're getting into issues with regards to soliciting for that. It could be like SEC type problems, depending on who you're marketing to. And it's just so I would not actively. I would just make this personal. I would not be out there mailing and calling and whatnot. So let's see here. Would you suggest, this is from Michael, would you suggest a 15-year financing if you can do it, over 30-year? I would say it depends on what you're looking for. My preference would be 30 years because I'm looking for cash flow. And one of the reasons I think that way is I've made the joke before that you're not a real estate investor unless you're cash poor. Generally, you have these assets and they're very, very cash intensive. You're buying a property, generally speaking, the cheapest property you're even going to find, even if you're in very very inexpensive areas, is $50,000. But generally, it's more like 100, 150 or more. And in some areas, 500 is cheap. For that reason, it's really hard to get a property to cash flow, to have a positive cash flow, if you are on a 15-year amortization, because you're paying so much principal off each month right at the beginning. Now, on a 30-year amortization, you're barely paying any principal off in your the first few months, and really to about the 15-year point, not really making a dent into it. 15 years, right off the bat, you're paying about a third of your payment is principal, which is great. But what it means is your cash flow is going to be lower, which is going to be harder to build up funds for the next acquisition. And also, one of the key things that banks look for is your DSCR ratio, your debt service coverage ratio. And what that is basically your net operating income. The amount of income you can bring into the property minus all of your operating expenses is your net operating income. And what they're looking for is how much more is that net operating income than the amount that you're going to have to pay for your mortgage. So they have your debt service, which is basically how much you're paying for your mortgage, which includes principal and interest. And then you have your NOI. So it's the NOI divided by your debt service. So let's say you bring in, let's do the math well. So let's do the math easier. So you bring in $1,000 a month, and your debt NOI, and your debt service coverage rate, and your debt service is $750 a month. So it'd be 1,000 divided by 750, which, if my math is correct, would be a 1.33 debt service coverage ratio. Most banks want at least a 1.2. Some want a 1.25. And so that's particularly important for for full-time real estate investors, because that's sort of our lifeblood. If we can't get our debt service coverage ratio to hit that 1.2, banks aren't going to lend to us, and then we're just kind of stuck. Now, if you have a job or something like that, you have that ability to add your own income to that mix, using whatever rental properties you have, that rental income plus your own income. But at the same time, it's just the more principal you're paying off each month, the harder it is. But that being said, if you can afford it and you're doing a conservative strategy, the more principal you pay off, the quicker, the safer you are. So, before the financial crisis, you had people taking out these ninja loans. They had negative, fully financed, negatively amortized. So it was like you're paying off less than just the interest. So actually your principal balance would go up for a few years during the teaser period before it just switch over and your payment would jump by 80% or whatever. And I can't think of a more dangerous way to finance where you have no margin in the property to begin with and you actually go backwards. The more you pay off, the quicker, the bigger margin you have, and the more you can stomach if the market goes down or you have any problems like that. Or if for some reason, you have to really fire sale the property, you can take a bigger haircut. So you have a lot more room there to work with, and also, the more principal you pay off, the more you can pull out when you eventually sell, the more you can refinance out if you decide to do that. I would just say it this way: for a real estate investor with a growth mindset, the 30-year is better. For a real estate investor with a conservative, I want to build up for my retirement type of mindset, the 15-year is better. And it just depends on what you're looking for. Okay, this is from Adam. Do you go for the first deal or the funding first? It seems hard to get one without the other. What I would say is you want to start lining up your financing immediately. Once you've done your, start listening to my live streams and reading my blog posts. That will help. But no, get on BiggerPockets, read the books, learn. Go to the RIA meetings, start to learn as much as you can. Next point, you want to build your team, and one of the most important components of your team is financing. So at this point, you're going to want to look for private lenders. You don't need a deal yet. If you have one, great, but you don't need one. Go to banks, you can get a pre-approval letter from a bank. There's no reason not to do this. All the better, especially if you don't have the cash. If you're making an offer on a property and you aren't making a cash offer, it's financed, and you don't have a pre-approval letter, a lot of sellers are just going to not even going to look at it. So go to banks right away and try to get a pre-approval letter. Try to build rapport. We've worked with 11 different banks here in Kansas City, and many more in Oregon and whatnot. And I've talked to probably 50, 60, 70, I don't even know. I want more than one bank to go to. Even if one bank was gave us the best interest rates and had an infinite amount of money to lend us, I would want more options, because if we've had banks that were our absolute best bank, and then all of a sudden we either hit their lending limit or they got gun shy or whatever, and then all of a sudden they've kind of fallen to the back burner. Whereas other banks where we got one bank that's just kind of been a consistent one, very small. They don't like making big loans, just a couple $100,000 each time, but they're just very consistent. And so different banks, different appetites. Sometimes different terms, and we try to get as many as possible. And in that same sense, I would try to look for as many banks as possible as well early on. I'll get into some tips for finding banks too as soon as I get through the different how. Maybe take one more question here. Let's see. So here's from Derek. For my first property to get into investing, what are your thoughts on a single-family live-in flip or a duplex long-term hold? And what would be some good options to finance either or? So as far as, I would say it really just kind of depends. The single-family live-in flip, that's house hacking, and I think that's a great method too. It's a great flipping method. It's also, you can use that for buy and hold too. I have a friend in Poughkeepsie, New York, actually, who buys he buys a property, lives in it. All student rentals around Marist College, I believe, and he buys property, lives in it, fixes it up, moves out, moves students in, and just kind of goes from one to the next to the next. So I think both strategies are good. It kind of just depends. Are you looking to make some money with a flip, with a single family live-in flip, or are you looking to to start getting a buy and hold right away? I don't know if I have a recommendation there, but I would say with regards to how to finance them, there's more options with regards to financing flips. I would say hard money comes back into play. Hard money should be the last option because it's very expensive, but it can work with a flip. It can't really work with a hold. But I would say private loans would be my favorite. If you don't have, if you have the money, of course, go ahead and do it. If you're going to be doing a like the duplex, and you have a job right now and you're making money, my recommendation is go with the FHA. Your neighbor / tenant will pay for at least a good chunk of your mortgage payment, and so right off the bat you're starting to pay down that you're paying for most of your expenses there, and then after a year you can move on to the next one. You can maybe, if you get a really good deal, you can refinance that with another loan. You can only have one FHA loan at a time, and then get another FHA loan, another probably maybe a fourplex or something like that. So it kind of depends on your situation, but if you're going for the duplex, I would recommend looking into the FHA option. I'd also, and for either one, I would look at the private loan option, unless of course you have some money, in which case you have some more options as well. On the flip side of private lending, you can also do partnerships. And this would be more of if you're going to be doing partnerships, you'd probably want somebody who has a little bit more money, can do more than just one kind of thing. But in this sense, what you're taking is somebody who has a good amount of money but doesn't have a lot of time, or maybe doesn't have a lot of interest in investing in real estate. And what you can bring to the table is the sweat equity, whereas they bring the money. And so you can split this partnership however you like, but 50-50, 60-40, I mean, it just depends on however you negotiate it. Maybe it depends on how much money if you can bring a little bit of money to the table. A lot of people like to see at least a little bit of skin in the game, more so than just sweat equity. But you set up a partnership arrangement and then just start purchasing properties from that way. It's like you purchase a property, you oversee the rehab, maybe do some of the rehab depending on how much time and energy you have in that respect. Oversee getting the property rented, getting the property refinance or finance up front with a bank loan, so you only have to put 20% in. You just split the equity and split the returns, and then move on from one to the next, and then maybe at some point you're at the position financially where you don't need a partner anymore. I mean, Brandon Turner has done a lot of these things. He's partnered on several apartments and things like that with with people on BiggerPockets. So you can do one-offs, especially if it's a bigger property. But that is another really good method. Again, if you're looking to partner with somebody, negotiate the terms, have a lawyer, make sure to get a lawyer to sign up those contracts. You should get a lawyer involved, whatever you're doing in this respect. If you're doing private loans, you should have them look over your trust deed or your mortgage, depending on which state you're in, and your note and whatnot. And then let's see, have I gone? Oh yeah, creative financing. Well, actually, let's see if there are any other good questions here. Okay, that was less frustrating. Let's go into creative financing real quick. So creative financing is great, but at the same time, it's one of those things that gets oversold a lot by guru types. So you got to be careful with it. Like, there is not some secret hidden formula where you don't have to put any money into a property at all, and can just print money. But some of the best ways to do it in this regard are seller financing. Let's start on seller financing really quick, and this is just basically the seller lending money back to you. Like some people who send out direct to seller marketing yellow letters and things like that will look, do searches on listsource or DataQuick or whatnot for people with a large amount of equity in their property. Oftentimes, with basically one that gives them the ability to sell you at a discount. If they're mortgaged up to the top, there's nothing there. There's no way for them to sell it to you for under market value because they got to pay off their loan. It also gives them the potential to lend you back money. And so the thing about this is, if they're let's say they have no mortgage on the property at all, even if they lend you 100% back, unless they're going to lend you more, which I've heard of, but it's going to be rare, you're not going to have any money for the rehab. You could get a second from them. A lot of banks don't like this seconds and whatnot. They'll put it in the loan docs again, but generally they don't know, and I don't really think they care. But it's one of those things to know. A lot of banks don't accept that, and actually might trigger the do on sale clause. But you could have them loan back a second, or you could have them loan back the whole thing. And maybe if it doesn't need a lot of rehab, it's not a big deal. You can do it yourself. But it's something. Or again, having some money is having a little bit of money for buy and hold is sort of required. And if you don't have it, it's best to earn it, and either wholesaling, being a real estate agent, keeping your job, something like that. Get to the point where you have $10,000 or something like that in the bank, at least before you start going on that. You can also do things like a contract for deed or a land sales contract, which is similar but different from a lease option. Like a land sales contract is what I'm more familiar with, and basically the same thing. But that is with Oregon, and basically gives you an equitable interest in the property until a certain date. And oftentimes they just deed these over to you. Or subject to, where you take over their loan, subject to the existing financing. This is a little bit of a gray area. It definitely triggers the due on sale clause, and I have heard of banks calling these loans, in which case, unless you can pay off the loan or get a private loan on top of it, you're pretty much out of luck. But what you're doing is you're saying purchase the property subject to the existing financing. So if they have a loan for X amount, let's say $100,000, the property's worth $120,000, and it doesn't need much work, you could maybe say, like, I'll give you $1,000 and subject to the loan if they just need to get out of it, or pay off say they're behind on their mortgage, pay off the arrearages. And so again, there's risk there, but it isn't your name on the note, but at the same time, you want to do right by anybody you're buying from. So there is risk with subject to, so be very careful in that respect. And then also you can do lease options. Lease options do not give you ownership of the property, but gives you the option to purchase the property at a later date. And so if it could be one of those things where I like sandwich lease options. You lease option the property from them, and then lease the property to somebody else with the potential to buy later, or you just have a certain set price. This is more for it's a hybrid flipping strategy, effectively, where you're buying the property with an option, you're leasing the property with the option to buy at a later date, and maybe you lease it to another person and give them to purchase at another date, both being a little bit higher price. I'm not a big fan of lease options because they generally, if you find somebody who wants to do a lease option, it's the person who basically wants to buy but should be leasing, and I rarely see them go through. And it's not a great buy and hold strategy, but those are strategies to know of. The most important ones for buy and hold would generally be seller financing and subject to. But still, as with pretty much everything else I've said, there's no free lunch. You're generally going to have to put a little bit of your own money into the property, or at least have a backstop in case you go over and rehab, because generally speaking, I've never heard of people complaining like I'm always over budgeting. It's always the other way around. So from Lee, how much cash flow should I be looking for in the first property? So this is always a question, but the way I look at it is I want a property to cash flow at least $100 a month, preferably more if it's a bigger house. Like if it's apartment units, I might go for $75 a month. But I want to find cash flow at least $100 a month, fully financed with a private loan, so 8 or 9% interest, and with conservative assumptions. I don't want to assume that I'm going to have 5% vacancy. Unless it's a really good area, you just assume 10%. And I'm going to assume the maintenance costs are going to be, they're not, maybe depending on the house, $500, $600 a year, and that's over and above any sort of whatever you take back from the deposit, and that doesn't include capital repairs like things like the roof and things like that. So I try to put in general conservative assumptions, and then look for at least $100 a month, more so maybe $150, $200 if it's a house or a bigger house. Each month, even with fully financed. Now, I look at it differently with apartments a little bit. As I said, I can accept a little bit less. I'm also looking at the cap rate more so, but I'm usually looking at cash flow for months. And that's kind of my second number when I'm looking at houses. I'm also looking at just the rent to cost, depending on the area, and that depends on the area. So some areas I might want a 1.5%. Some areas I'll settle for 1%. If you've heard of the 2% rule, it's garbage. Not a fan. Those are the types of properties. Generally, the types of properties that will work with the 2% rule are in war zones, and they only work on paper. Once you actually start having to pay for, major turnovers after a tenant trashes your house or whatever, then all of a sudden, all your money goes bye-bye. Basically, property costs more to operate than it brings in. So that's my general rule of thumb. I look at three numbers with regards to house. I'm looking at obviously I look at the value. My main number I'm looking for is value. I want to buy a property with at least 25% equity. And that's my main criteria. So I'm doing comparative market analyses, which is kind of outside the scope of this particular live stream. But with regards to cash flow, I'm looking for at least 100, generally more, so, but it depends on the type of property. A little bit less if it's apartments, more so if it's a bigger house or a nicer house or a more expensive house. And I want it to full cash flow at that level, fully financed with conservative assumptions. And I also look at the cap rate. But a lot of that, you have a house, you just have one unit, and you have a really bad turnover 1 year, your cash flow is going to be horrible. Whereas if you have a tenant that just stays the whole time, doesn't call you for maintenance, your cash flow is going to be great. So cap rates are a little bit tougher with houses. They don't work as well. They're even tougher with anything under 4 units or so. Cap rates are best for either apartments or office buildings or things like that. Let's see if we got... So this is from Eric. Andrew, how did you start and scale up? Okay, so I started, probably better would be from my father's perspective. My dad started the company. I ended up joining him in an internship he had in 2006, and then we flipped a bunch of houses in Oregon for a couple of years, and then I eventually moved out to Kansas City, and we started buying real estate here. My brother ended up joining me about a little less than a year later. By the way, my brother will be on our live stream next week, same time, same place. We'll be talking about property management, about how to relate. How he's probably the best I've ever seen at tenant relations, and getting extremely angry tenants to like you and also pay the rent. So I'd highly recommend being there. He will be with me next week. My father started basically with I would call it I'd say private loans / save and hold. He had a job and he was always interested in real estate. He tried actually in Portland, and it didn't work out well. I think he lost a little bit of money there. It would have worked out well. He once bought a house and was all into it for $70,000 in Portland, and this was in 86, I think. And then he sold it for I think 77 or something like that. He basically broke even, lost a little bit of money. Ran into the guy in 2013 who bought it from him, and that guy had sold the house for like 70 or 67 and lost money. And he said he just figured out the guy who the property just sold again. This is in Portland, Oregon. It sold for $950,000. So he would have done just fine had he held his stuff in Portland, but not so much. But basically, he got some loans, a couple loans from his father, private loans on these properties, and was able to use his own savings to kind of make up the gap there for any excess rehab that needed to be done. And that got him started, got his foot in the door, got a couple of properties. And then he ran into this private lender, or actually we call him a medium money lender, because he was very different than most of the hard money lenders you see out there. He would lend more around like 2 points and 8 to 10% interest at the time. And so this was actually, I have not seen any of this on the market, by the way, so I don't think that this is not really a way to go. But in a lot of ways, it's like a private lender, except for he had a lot more sources. And that was how he started to really pick it up and buy more and more. And then, real estate has that snowball effect, that compounding effect. It sort of scales itself. As long as you can keep up with the management side and the operations side, as time goes by, you start paying principal down. The property starts to depreciate. You get to the point where you can refinance it, pull out money, and then just continue to do it. And especially as over the course of he's had his operation going for, what are we at now? Just 29 years, just 1 year shy of 30. And with the appreciation that's had and the time for the principal to be paid down, as well as just accumulated cash flow, he's been able to kind of put that on top of itself more over and over again. And you build a reputation. You find a private lender here, find a private lender there. You build a reputation. You have something to fall back on. Even just having a website is a really, really good sort of like validation of your ability. Having a website, having business cards, having a printed out business plan that's bound and put those nice with the transparent cover and all the stuff like that, looking very professional, and with a very clear, thought out plan of how you're going to do this is a great way to sell any potential private lender on your competence and your ability to follow through, as well as just explaining the advantages of real estate and how having that trustee or that mortgage on a property gives them a lot of protection, because worst case scenario, they can just take the property back, especially if you're willing to just deed it back to them and not actually make them foreclose on you if it goes to that, which I would, God forbid, but if that does happen, be nice to your private lenders.
This is from Derek. What is the time frame between when a bank can and cannot call a loan due after purchasing property subject to? I wrote it weird. Okay, so when a bank basically what they'll do is they'll send you I think it's a non-compliance letter, something along those lines. And at that point, since you've already subject to the property, you've already transferred ownership, they pretty much have the right to begin the foreclosure process. Now, again, you are not on the loan, so they can't hurt your credit in that way. But you will. It would. But at the same time, they can't take the property back, especially if you put some money into it. Now, how long it takes to foreclose on a property depends on the state. And in some states, particularly more liberal states, like New York or Oregon or California, it can take quite a while. I've seen. I mean, this is more so during the financial crisis. I saw ones drag out for 2 years or something like that. But they usually won't take that long. But it just depends on the state. It's usually going to be a good number of months. But at the same time, once they start that process, there's really nothing to do other than try to convince them not to do it. Now, I have never been in this situation. I've only heard of it. So I don't know. Most banks probably don't really care as long as the mortgage is being paid. That's what they want. They want the mortgage to be paid. But at the same time, in a market that's as hot as this one, they're probably going to get back their investment, even, or at least most of it, if they foreclose and sell the property. And they may want to just, I don't know, discourage this behavior. I'm not really sure why they would do it, but it would take a while. But the main thing I would say is just that once they start, there's not much you can do other than simply renting out the property. And this is really moving toward close to equity skimming, which are things like, for example, there was a scam, particularly just after the financial crisis, where unscrupulous, I won't even call them investors, unscrupulous individuals would get a property subject to or lease option or something like that and say they're just going to take over the payments. And then they rent out the property and they would do nothing, and they just collect the rent from whatever their tenant was until the property was foreclosed on. And then they weren't on the loan, so it didn't matter. They just collected 6-7 months rent or whatever, and then moved on. And the person who thought that their loan had been, or their issue, their delinquency had been resolved, the foreclosure was going to be stopped, just all of a sudden their credit's got this foreclosure on it, and this tenant who thought they were just renting a house gets to move out. So you're moving, this is not the same thing, but at the same time you're kind of flirting with it. So I would be very, very cautious about anything like that. You don't want to get into equity skimming. Reputation takes a lifetime to build up and can be ruined in 5 minutes. So I would say, even if it's a cheap buck, even if it seems in the gray area, I would lean against it. And so that's just something to know and be careful about. This is from Mr. Skills. Have you heard of Airbnb arbitrage? If so, do you suggest doing it? I have not. You please give me a description of what Airbnb arbitrage is. Is that like a sandwich lease option, like Airbnb being a property that's being Airbnb'd, or actually, well, maybe I know someone who rented a property and then Airbnb'd it out. Is that what you're referring to? If that's what you're referring to, I know one in particular that was very successful doing a sort of a luxury market, and made it basically rented out the property base fee and split, like, I think, give 10% on top of the Airbnb profits, and made a huge amount of money in this property. That being said, Airbnb is getting tougher. In Kansas City, they just put in, or I think this is in Kansas City, Kansas, they put in an ordinance where Airbnb is only allowed if like they can ask all the residents around the property, if or all of your neighbors, and if they say no, then you're not allowed to do it. Other sorts of restrictions, and all sorts of other sorts of restrictions. And so it's getting really, it's with regards to Airbnb just in general, my biggest concern about it, I'd be hesitant to buy property with the only way it works being an Airbnb strategy, unless for some reason this market is not going to crack down on it. Just legislative issues make it really dangerous, in my opinion. Unless it's just supplement, like it works as a rental, but it works even better as an Airbnb. That's fine. Go for that direction. But yeah, and you also have a very powerful lobbying industry. The hospitality industry is not particularly fond of Airbnb, so they've got a lot of pressure, and a lot of people. And Airbnb can be annoying. I mean, I wouldn't want my neighbor to be, renting out their unit as if it was a hotel. So you've got a powerful local force and a large lobbying group that are both fighting against it. And so legislatively, I'd be very, very nervous about that. Okay, this is from Linda. So when you do seller financing with 20% down, can you borrow the 20% from a bank? Yeah, I mean that's pretty much basically. Oh no, I'm sorry. Well, you can, but very unlikely. I mean, you can get a second mortgage. Back in the day, pre-financial crisis, a lot of banks would give you a 80% first and a 20% second. The 80% first would be at 5%, and the 20% second would be at 9% or something like that. And they did a lot of these types of loans. Those completely disappeared, and I think they're still pretty rare. I haven't seen any recently. You could borrow the 20% from friends or family or whatnot. Again, banks often don't like to see a second mortgage on the property. They won't look generally, but again, all these things are like, if you're willing to risk it, it's not a matter of illegality, at least from my understanding. Talk to a lawyer, of course. But it's a matter of, just triggering that due on sales clause or getting a bank angry at you, neither of which you want to do. But you could potentially get a private loan for that second, or you could just borrow some money, especially from family, where I'd write it out. Always write it out, because memories fade. Always write out whatever the terms and agreement is, but it doesn't necessarily need to be recorded against the property. I've seen people like crowdfunding is one thing I haven't discussed. I haven't gotten too much into crowdfunding, but there are all sorts of crowdfunding real estate websites. Often they're trying to put together crowdfunding for larger investments, like I think crowdfunding. I'm trying to think of one of the names of one. It's just drawing a blank for some reason. Those are usually looking to crowdfund the investment for a larger investment, something similar to a syndication, which is not a newbie strategy. So we'll leave that to the side for now. But in regards to, I've seen people on like Prosper.com, which you look for. Oftentimes you're looking for small loans, crowdfunded, microcredit type of thing. I think they have a $25,000 maximum. Often, like I'm building a deck, or I want to do, I'm trying to pay off some credit cards and get a better interest rate or whatever. Those types of options are a possibility to look into. I'm not an expert on it, but I do know crowdfunding has gotten a lot more popular recently. But as far as borrowing the 20% from a bank, unless you're going to get a bank to offer a second, and usually have to be the same bank, no. And that is, if at best, very rare these days. The fully financed thing is really out of style, and it probably should be, other than with regards to FHA loans, which are almost fully financed. So we've been going here for almost an hour. Let's see if we got any other. I don't even know. I think we might have to set up another live stream for with regards to finding banks and convincing banks to lend to you, because we spend most of our time here just going over all the different strategies and some various questions. Let's see here. I haven't looked at any questions here. Let's see if there are any other questions that I might have missed. This is, what do you think of lease options? Have you used it before? We have done lease options before. It's not, it's with regards to lease options, unless, you think the market is going to go up a lot and you have a good option to purchase it. That's a possibility to do it. But again, even when you're purchasing it, even if the market's gone up a lot and you're buying it for a lower price, you will not find a bank that will lend to you a purchase at the appraised value. It will only be how much you're spending on it. And then maybe if you're trying to do, if you have repairs or rehab to do, you can get some of that. You can get that finance too, and they'll put it in escrow. And as you finish certain parts and send in their invoices, they'll release more of that money to you. But they're not going to finance you over. Let's say you buy it at, you get a lease option and you have an option to purchase the property at $200,000 in 2 years or 1 year, whatever, and the property appreciates to $250,000. Now you get an 8% loan at $250,000, you could buy the property with no money down. No bank will do that. I've never heard of a bank being willing to do that. They'll still only lend you on that, 80% of that $200,000 purchase price, not what the property's worth. It's always less of the two. Now, a private lender, they might look at it differently. But as far as using lease options like that, you might get a good deal because it's sort of your hedge. If the market goes up, you can purchase it. If the market doesn't, you can walk. Although again, a lot of these options have an option fee where you have to pay something up front. But if you're looking at a motivated seller, or something along those lines. Maybe they won't be as they won't probably require something. They won't probably require that. Sorry. Let's see, what else we got? So this is it's from Robert. Should I buy my first property with hard money? We talked about this a little bit. My recommendation is if you're flipping, that can work. If you can find another way to purchase it, again, I highly recommend going that direction. But if that's the only option you have, I mean, that's the only option you have. That being said, and remember, when you're putting your budget together, rehab costs, acquisition costs, your cost to sell, real estate agent, whatnot, you need to have your holding costs in there too. And if you're using a hard money loan, that's going to cost a lot. I mean, again, 12 to 15% interest, 3 to 5 points, and some other fees too. A lot of hard money lenders still require appraisals. So you've got to factor all that in and still have room. If you don't have any room after that, a lot of I've seen hard money loans that's so expensive that these flippers, they end up not making any money just because it all went to the hard money lender. Now it can work. You just need a bigger margin. With buy and hold, I do not recommend it. It's too expensive. It will eat up your margin, and you can fire sell a property if you need to, or not fire sell, but you can reduce the price. But if you run into problems with getting a loan, you want to be able to keep it going for a while. Whereas, like, let's say for some reason you get bad appraisals and you want to go to a new bank, or a bank backs out at you, or drags their feet, or whatever. That's happened to us before, and I don't like the idea of having to maintain this loan with 15% interest for who knows how long, because it's just, I don't know. You'd have to get an incredible steal for property cash flow with that kind of interest. Let's see. Well, I think we're at about an hour now. Thank you again. I only got to the first half of this. I'll have to set up another live stream for how to find banks and also how to convince banks to lend to you, both of which are very important topics, and both of them don't get quite as much attention as I think they deserve. Next week, though, I'll be with my brother. We'll be talking about property management, which is an awful lot of fun. It's so much fun, in fact, that I, as the older brother, gave it to my younger brother. And so, again, I thank you all very much. I will post a couple of articles I've written in the comments section, particularly on how to finance properties, how to find lenders, how to convince them to lend to you. And I'll try to answer a few other questions. If you have any others, feel free to leave them, and I will do my best to answer them after this ends. But thank you very much, and I'll see you all next week.